Hello and welcome to this episode of In Session from Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter Munley, and I am coming to you from the beautiful Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in downtown Bennington. And I am so happy to be joined by our guests this Saturday morning, Representative Mary Morrissey, Representative Timothy Corcoran, and Senator Seth Bongartz. Welcome to you all.
Back.
Good morning, Jack.
And we've got a lot of different things to get caught up on the state level, on the national level, and on the local level, because we're just coming out of town meeting day. But before we get into that, I do want to quickly ask you, Senator Bongartz, just because you haven't been on the show since the vote to confirm Michael Drescher, we did talk a little bit with Senator Plunkett about how his deliberative process was on that. For anyone who was following that, or as a quick refresher, Michael Drescher was confirmed to the Vermont Supreme Court in a vote through the Vermont Senate that was actually a tie that was broken by the Lieutenant Governor, with both yourself, Senator Bongartz, and Senator Plunkett breaking with the Democratic senators and voting for confirmation. Senator Plunkett was very forthcoming about his sort of deliberative process, and I'm interested to hear from you about how that decision was reached, and how you approached the question of confirming Michael Drescher.
Well, Senator Plunkett and I went through that process together in large measure. I mean, it was very interesting, though. For a little while, we had, before it got closer to the vote, we've been doing our own thinking about it. Then we talked one day and realized that we were both thinking pretty much the same thing. And then we really engaged in the process together, and of meeting with Michael Drescher. He met us in Manchester one Saturday. We spent an hour and a half or so with him, and then we each individually had separate phone calls. I had two more, and I think that he had at least two more with him as well. But it really was, and Rob. Senator Plunkett read every pleading having to do with the cases in question, and we talked about those. But I think it really was that I'll speak for myself, I guess. I really came to the conclusion that this was a dedicated public servant who consistently tried to do the right thing, found himself in a really horrible position, and had only bad choices to make. And I think made the one that he believed was going to bring the system the closest to justice, to protect the integrity of the office in Vermont, the U.S. Prosecutor's Office, and keep it from becoming some of the worst that we've seen in other parts of the country. And I think in the end he was proven right. And I'll tell you the story that I mentioned this on the Senate floor. I forget the names I hadn't expected this, so I don't know the names in my head, but the young woman who went through the process. And she had been whisked away to Wisconsin, wherever it was. I think it was Wisconsin. But the jurisdiction remained in Vermont. And after the hearing, Judge Sessions verbally issued the order that should be released, and should be released without condition. They refused to do that. And they were insisting on putting a monitoring bracelet on her ankle. She refused, to her credit, to her great credit. She refused. And Michael Drescher got a call from the attorney who had been the legal aid attorney, or who had been working with her and had been in court that day. She told him what happened, what was happening, they wouldn't release her. And he said, let's get Judge Sessions on the line. The ACLU attorney, incidentally. And he said, let's get Judge Sessions on the line right now. They did. They told him what was going on. And Michael Drescher said to Judge Sessions, a written order right now would be really helpful. So what we have is somebody who once the order was given, if this had been, I don't mean to politicize this, but if this had been a Trump appointee on somebody who would have taken Michael Drescher's place because of, never would have taken the call in the first place. Number two, never would have lifted a finger to help. And in this instance, Michael Drescher showed his true integrity and helped get her released the way she was supposed to get released according to the order. And I think that just spoke volumes to me. Everything else, but that on one level, minor story, although not for her, really made it just become crystal clear in my mind that everything Michael Drescher was saying to us about the way that he tried to conduct himself really brought it into clear focus.
I appreciate that additional context because I think those are the things that even those of us who've been following this fairly closely may not even know that level of granular detail. Just as a quick follow-up, and I asked this to Senator Plunkett as well, why do you think some of that context was maybe not as compelling to some of your Democratic colleagues? And what have you heard, if anything, from constituents since the vote?
I have to say, because it's true, I don't think anybody dug as deep as we did. And we went down levels and really understood what was going on, and nobody else read the pleadings the way that Senator Plunkett did, including me. He did it, so that worked out well. But we sent out a newsletter afterwards with attaching our floor comments, and I have received like 85% positive comments, that even people saying, I'm still not sure I agree with you, but I understand the thoughtful process you went through, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I'm not sure if I do or I don't, but so it really it's been kind of rewarding because frankly, it feels like there's an element of trust in the community for the fact that Rob and I really did what we did and tried to do it well and make the right decision. And so that's been rewarding.
That's really good to hear. And it is something that, I would encourage folks to go in and listen to both of your floor speeches related to this. And, for anybody who's curious about it, I think the episode that Senator Plunkett was a guest on and his answers to some of these questions, I think, are also informative, but definitely something good to dig in some layers on. Okay, so shifting from that to some hyper local stuff, because we did just have town meeting day across the state and particularly here in Bennington. And before getting into some of the substance of the results, something that I have certainly heard about from quite a few people was the feeling that this was a pretty low energy town meeting day here in Bennington. There weren't really any contested races. We'll get to the sort of headline result that did come out of Bennington. But even from people who were there in the room on Monday evening and then folks who watched at home, there was just a feeling of, I would like there to be a little bit more interest, investment, excitement. Nobody even had questions during the town meeting itself. So I'm curious, I want to go around to the three of you, whether you accept that premise or not. What would your sort of number one desire be to try and get more people connected to the town meeting process or to turn out for these kinds of local elections? I'll start with you, Representative Corcoran.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's, I think it's a little bit of a sign of the times. Town meetings have been, dwindling over the years, and it's almost it's all predicated on the issue of that particular year. If you're going to get a huge draw, as you mentioned, we didn't have any local races. There wasn't any big sexy item, bond vote or anything like that that was going to draw people out. So it was a low turnout. And back in the day, town meeting, the night before, that was a big event. You'd probably get over 100+ people. And I don't mean obviously I attended, but it was probably less than, I don't know, 50 people or so. And that's unfortunate. And hopefully, I think it stems to with our youth, to try to get them engaged, having civics in, maybe a mandatory course in high school to get them engaged somehow. But we definitely need to turn the tide for sure, to get more involvement because, democracy depends on different viewpoints. You need, regardless of what side you're on, you need that debate and try to come to an agreement. And without participation, it's, you get one-sided results. And so that's unfortunate. But again, it's just, I think a lot of it this year was just there wasn't any major issues on the ballot. And I think that was statewide too. It was low turnout too. So I think probably the biggest thing was the write-in campaign in Rutland for the mayor. So and I think that was even relatively low. But yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents on that.
And another item, sort of statewide, and to your point about how many are able to participate in town meeting, was also the question of the representative town meeting over in Brattleboro, which was in fact voted out for an open town meeting, and then they still need to resolve exactly how that's going to function based on other pieces that passed. But it does seem there's a desire in that community to open up the process. I'll pass it over to you, Representative Morrissey, as somebody who was there at town meeting, very involved in the proceedings, which was wonderful as always. What would you sort of suggest as ways to get folks a little bit more engaged with the town meeting process?
Well, very much like, Tim said, civic courses. I remember over the years as a member of the Board of Civil Authority that are the folks that sit and check folks in and are part of the election day process. I've been in that, have been elected to that position now for 30 some years. And we've had over the years where teachers would come in with their students and observe what was going on, and many of the schools would have classes that talked about upcoming votes, and likewise they would then come to the actual voting place within a community. I know North Bennington used to do that as well, and I know other areas, but Bennington did. So I think those types of opportunities would be great to get, especially young people, thinking about the importance of voting. Now, again, this year there was not a lot of candidates that you were running against each other. So that does usually kind of have maybe a lower interest. But I think our citizens need to remember you're voting in budgets for your schools, for your town, and it's important to be engaged in it. So often I'll have folks come up to me and will say, oh, the taxes are way too high, and, they'll make other comments. And, sometimes I'll ask, did you get out to vote and voice your opinion by your vote as to the process? And sometimes I've had people say they didn't vote, and that is a voter's right to have their voice heard through their vote. And I think sometimes folks might not look at it quite in that respect. I think also, and I hate to use COVID again. It's used so often as why things have changed. But I think folks have gotten a little bit away from that intermingling, at functions such as, gathering for a vote or where more people are gathering. And I just wish we could turn that around, because we have put so many pieces of law into place that encourage or allow many different ways, even like same-day voter registration, where folks can come in that day, and if they're not registered, can register and then vote. And yet the numbers were very low this year, which is, to me, very disappointing, because there are, unfortunately, countries around the world where their citizens don't get the right to vote, and it is a privilege to be able to vote.
I think that is an important perspective to keep, and especially at a time when there is so much rhetoric about the importance of the democratic process and democracy. It's interesting to see how that does or does not connect in these really tangible grassroots expressions of democracy, and not just representative democracy, but participatory democracy. For you, Senator Bongartz, you're obviously up in Manchester, so you can have a little bit of a different perspective to bring us about another town meeting day, but also because of your position as a senator covering such a wide geographical area. I remember last year on the show, part of our discussion was about how you and Senator Plunkett would have to think about, where do you actually go on town meeting day? Senator Plunkett was with us down here in Bennington, but with that as another layer of sort of seeing different town meetings and how they operate. Same question for you about encouraging participation, but also, do you have a perspective from what some other locations within the county are
Yeah.
doing?
So I starting Saturday morning after we adjourned Fridays, we came down, and starting Saturday morning in North Bennington for the next 4 days, I was at school and town meetings, including the healthcare forum that we held Sunday afternoon when we had Senator Lyons come down, and including a meeting with the Bennington Chamber on what morning was that, Tim and
I
Mary?
think that was Monday, maybe.
Monday.
Monday
Monday. Yeah, Monday.
Yeah.
And so what I did I talked to Senator Plunkett. We decided he would go to Bennington, and I tagged along with Jonathan Cooper. And we had a lot of fun, actually. We went to Woodford, Searsburg, Reedsboro, and Stamford, and the goal was to get back to and finish in Pownell, but we didn't make it. By the time they got back, they had closed. But I have to say, in both Reedsboro and Stamford, I was stunned by the turnout. It was kind of the opposite of what we're talking about here. Reedsboro, I guess I wasn't stunned, because the closing of the school was the topic for the school meeting, which was first. And as you know, they voted to close the school. But Stamford is one of the old town meetings where they actually, I think, vote most things from the floor. And that tends to increase turnout, and as opposed to Australian ballot. So that meeting had, I don't know, 100, 120 people for a pretty small town. But actually, like I said, it was a lot of fun to go to all those meetings. And the first one is always North Bennington, the school meeting early on Saturday morning. But the same thing, Manchester had people. That was on Saturday afternoon. But not a ton of big issues, so not as big a turnout. It does, it just depends on whether there's big issues.
And I want to stay on that question of big issues, but also I'm glad you mentioned what was going on in Reedsboro, because one of the big issues, whether it was on the ballot in anything other than the form of school budgets, is the question of education spending throughout the state. And in fact, we did see here in Bennington the elementary school district budget did not pass. It failed by 18 votes, 1,002 votes to 1,020 votes. Across the state, 85 school budgets were passed and 19 failed, which is an 82% passage rate. So not anything like what was seen in 2024, but still an indication that this is top of mind, and certainly the framing of education spending as a top line issue is, having an effect on how folks get out and vote. And then here in Southern Vermont, both Reedsboro and Marlboro voted to close their schools, citing the cost and also the very low current attendance and the expectation that that attendance will get lower. I would like to hear from all three of you. I will start with you, Senator Bongartz, again, since you're on the Senate Education Committee and you've been leading a lot of this work in the Senate. What do you take from the fact that the elementary school budget did not pass here? And what do you foresee happening in the near future for Bennington's elementary schools?
Well, I don't know what, it's funny because there wasn't a ton of talk about it before the election, and it just didn't pass. So I don't know. Obviously, there'll be a revote, and they'll do a little work on the budget. And I suspect it may just be that it was such a low turnout election that that can happen. So people, and this goes to the points that Tim and Mary were making earlier. We have to pay attention, and we have to at the same time, I say that people are having a hard time paying their property taxes, and we really need to fix that. And I've been supportive of my mantra this year has been, I said it to my committee, I don't know how many times, we must slow the rate of increase. And we cannot afford, there's no way in the world we can keep having double-digit increases across Vermont and expect Vermonters to pay for it. We just can't do it. And that's why the governor has been right to at least, really force this discussion. And now it's just trying to figure out the right path forward. I think the foundation formula is the right model to put onto the system, because at least somebody will be in control and there will be a fixed multiplier. So Tim Payne, the new superintendent in the Southwest Vermont, just always says, in a way, I care less about how much money it is than I do predictability. I want to know what I have to work with, and I want to know year to year to year, and that's one of the things the foundation formula will do. So I don't want to, go in. It's so I can get too weedy too fast, so I'll just leave it at that. You can ask me more questions.
Well, I think something else that was made a point by the elementary school board was the efforts that they had made to really have a very small increase to the budget. I believe it was barely more than 1% as an increase, which would be less than even just the increases in staff healthcare costs. So, obviously the board will have to go back and look at the budget again, but they've been very clear about how much they've tried to limit the increase. I think you were mentioning that Tim Payne would say that he's wants to know about the predictability, and maybe that's more important than some of the other pieces. Something that I've certainly heard from quite a few people is that obviously student achievement would be another metric to be looking at. And there was just in the last few weeks some data that showed that across the board within the SVSU district, students are performing below state averages, which are already concerning for a lot of folks. The state averages are. So coming over to you, Representative Morrissey, with that all in mind, what do you sort of see as the path forward here? And do you take anything from the fact that this elementary school budget did not pass here in Bennington? Do you attribute it to the low turnout, or is there something else going on with that?
Well, I think, again, part of it was low turnout, but I, was surprised that sometimes when you see like a school budget, like the elementary school budget that went down, went down, I was almost surprised that you didn't see possibly the Mount Anthony budget going down, because I did attend over at the SVSU offices where their town meeting presentations were held, there was hardly anyone there. I mean, literally, there was, if 10 people, that would be a large amount. I don't even think there were 10 people. And I think it was, and again, I know they probably like to keep it within their building, but I know years ago, and not that long ago actually, we used to have the floor meetings for both the town and the schools all at the firehouse. And so people would be there for, like an hour or hour and a half time frame, but they didn't have to go from one building to another. And so I'm wondering if that has caused a little bit of people not going, to the school, but the school town meetings. I think if it was coordinated where the voters could go to one building again, that might help, because the time frame for the meetings started at like 5:30, and sometimes people are just coming out of work. And, if they could land at one place to hear both school and town would probably be easier. I really, can't put my finger on a specific reason why it would have been necessarily the elementary, but again, that does go to all the different districts. So maybe there were different issues within different towns that might have had more people voting against, that particular school budget. But there wasn't anything that really was overly apparent, except for, I know I heard a great deal from my constituents, especially during this town meeting week, about the taxes, and that folks just really are not being able to handle these increases, and it's just not sustainable.
I believe the statistic I saw most recently is that the education property tax has gone up about 40% in the last 5 years, which is startling when you see that, in terms of that is such a short period of time for such a large increase. The year-over-year increases are large, certainly when you're seeing double-digit numbers, but for it to be so big really does kind of put the nature of the issue in some perspective. I will bring the point that Representative Morrissey, sorry, go ahead, Representative Morrissey.
Well, I was going to say, and you do have to remember, Vermont is per pupil spending the highest in the country, and yet we have many of our schools, unfortunately, across the state, are failing to meet some basic standards. That's very concerning to me.
Absolutely. And there was just data about not only statewide achievement, but particularly here in SVSU, sort of where our SVSU students stack up statewide. And there's a lot of concern there around the fact that there are large numbers of students who are well below their expected grade averages. I do want to bring the question that Representative Morrissey brought up over to you, Representative Corcoran, about the fact that, is there any sense of why it might have been the elementary school budget that went down when the Mount Anthony budget passed, the town budget passed fairly comfortably? It didn't seem like this was entirely a turnout that was motivated by voting down spending in that way. Why maybe the elementary school budget?
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. Like I said, that's really tough to to decipher. But when you look at the numbers compared to the MAU, budget, I mean, that only passed by 149 votes. So, I mean, I'm not going to say it's just because it was a low turnout. I think obviously there's just frustration in general that maybe it's a sign for us to say, hey, don't let up. We need some type of relief, as Senator Bongard said, is we need to curb the spending. And I think that was part of the message too, because typically, if you look at our past votes on school budgets, uh, they usually pass fairly healthy, you know. So even, you know, with the, like I said, the MAU passing, it only passed by 149. And I think if you look at the track record, that is, in a sense, almost getting defeated. That's a statement in and of itself. So, I mean, it's like I said, I was, I don't say shocked, but I was surprised the elementary school budget did get voted down because, you know, being out in the community, I didn't, you know, there wasn't any like backlash or some big uproar that, oh, we gotta, you know, shoot this down. It was up, like you said, just barely 1%. That's basically level funding. You know, when you figure in the you know, the healthcare costs and all the fixed costs that they have to deal with, that is a you know, well budget that was presented. So yeah, that's surprising, but I think the overall message, you know, just speculation. I just think people, as to say, don't let up. You know, we have to, whatever it is.
Oops. Well, I think Tim froze, huh?
We'll give him a second.
Something has to be done at the end of the day, and I think that's the message that I, you know, take from this. Whoop! Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Am I back? No.
You're back.
All right. I don't know where I cut off, but yeah, tell you, internet nowadays. I gotta get, yeah. I won't say who I have because I don't want to get sued, but but yeah, I'm not sure what I left off, but you know, like I said, I think people are anxious of getting property tax relief at the end of the day. So
on that question of property tax relief and budgeting, I want us to move up to the state level, where this week Governor Scott did vote through $111 million towards the budget, the state budget, not for property tax relief, but to sort of safeguard against potential disruptions or cuts to federal spending. I know there was reference made to the interruptions to Three Squares Vermont through the interruptions to SNAP funding that did come through in the fall, where the state had to fill in some gaps there. And there are anticipations that that may come up in the future potentially around housing vouchers or potentially around Medicaid and other medical expenses. I want to bring it over to you, Senator Bongartz, just to sort of comment on where this sits as a budget adjustment. Was this expected? Is this a little bit unexpected in terms of the angle that the governor is taking with the advice of the legislature, obviously? Where does this sort of fit in terms of what we can expect to see from the state level, thinking about the degree to which there is now federal uncertainty around some of these programs?
Yes, I think the bottom line with the budget, with the Budget Adjustment Act, was to just not make decisions yet, and to hang on to resources and be able to utilize them better in the budget when it comes through. And because every couple of weeks you wait, you know a little bit more. So I think it was just prudence to hang on and preserve options until the big bill starts to come through.
And I'll bring it over to you, Representative Morrissey. As the big budget bill is making its way through, what impact do you think having this 111 million, not entirely set aside, but having it sort of put towards that weighting, what influence do you think that will have on the budgeting process?
Well, you know, obviously it could have a, you know, an impact on specific, you know, line items where, you know, the money may need to be lessened or increased depending upon how the, you know, what the budgets look like in different agencies as they were presented. it's been a difficult year to know because we'll hear so often, well, we didn't get what we were expecting from the federal government on particular programs. And so we have had to look at possible other ways of funding or shifting funding to provide for those programs. So as we roll out in the next couple of weeks here, because crossover is for bills to be going across, with the exception of the appropriations bill. Actually, Tim or Seth is on approach, correct?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not on the purpose.
Okay, but Tim is on transportation, which is a money bill, and I'm on the capital bill, which is also a money bill. And I'm sorry, Seth, I was thinking you're on approach. You've got your hands full, certainly filled with education. So, but those would have an impact as to the monies going in for different programs that, there. So it will be kind of an up and down, and looking at the necessity for these programs. But it's a process that it can be difficult because you're having to weigh different programs over other programs. And, I know over the years, and when I served on appropriations a number of years ago, it's a tough process because there are some programs that you would like to fund, but you may not be able to as much as you did. The ones that are really working and benefiting our Vermonters. Those are sometimes the tough decisions that you have to make. But it will certainly be a process going forward in the next couple of weeks. And usually there will be a ramp up of the advocates for the different programs if there is looking to be a level funding or less funding than they've had before. So it's a whole process that we will end up going through.
And with that in mind, I do want to bring it over to you, Representative Corcoran, since most of what was being discussed in terms of federal shortfalls was things like food assistance, medical needs, housing. Transportation was not as sort of top in a lot of the stories that I saw coming out about this, but I'm curious for you to speak on what this could mean as the transportation bill is getting put together, since it is a huge chunk of money, and it's one that, even aside from the federal shortfalls, the revenue streams for are decreasing over time, and so finding that money is getting harder and harder, even outside of federal uncertainties.
Yes, there's no doubt. I mean, I think obviously we rely quite heavily on federal dollars, but our concern in the transportation budget is actually state dollars. Just with declining revenues and the gas tax, cars being more efficient, our purchase and use, our car sales is declining. So it's not so much federal, it's trying to get these make our state dollars healthy. Our purchase and use, not to recap what I said the last time, but a third of that goes to the education fund, which is roughly $50 million. So the purchase and use sales brings in roughly 150, education gets 50, and we get 100 million. The governor has a proposal to claw back all of that over 5 years. So basically $10 million a year. But so yeah, ours, like I said, it's not so much the federal as the state. But just to go back to your, general question is that, the Appropriations Committee, I think a couple weeks ago, had was having public hearings and, getting feedback and requests. And, the amount of requests that they were getting, we could probably literally double our budget. It's a far cry from when we had COVID and I don't say we were a drunken sailor, but we were 10 million here, 5 million there, and it wasn't really a problem. Now, unfortunately, I give you an example, here in Bennington, with the 250th anniversary coming up, we were looking for some money for that celebration. $75,000, I think was what they requested. They're now not even sure they can get that, which is unfortunate. Because years ago up in Lake Champlain, when they had their 400 celebration for that, they had a license plate. They got, I think, roughly $400,000. And here we are trying to get 75 and we can't even get that. So it's as Mary said, the decisions are going to be extremely, extremely tough when programs are getting cut on the federal level, and it's devastating. One thing that we did do in the budget adjustment was sort of backfill cuts for the Section 8 program. Typically we don't put in state dollars because that's federal, but we put in I think it was $5 million to sort of ride that out and and see how that plays out. But it is, like I said, there's tough decisions that are going to have to be made between now and at the end of the year, and it's unfortunate because our revenues as a whole are declining. So I guess in a good sense, I'm glad I'm not on the Appropriations Committee because you're going to get a lot of people, like I said, that are going to be upset with you, and I'm sure it'll be for good reason, but it's not going to be for lack of our side trying to, do what's best and, spread out the dollars the best that we can. So it's going to be a challenging year for sure.
And with that as an overlay and using the Bennington 250 as an example of this on a previous program with Representative Nigro, who is on House Appropriations, and with Representative Durfee, we were discussing how these sorts of expenditures are framed and how they are often framed as investments. $75,000 for the Bennington 250. What kind of tourism revenue does that turn into? What kind of local business stimulation does that lead to? Similar for the Champlain 400 that you're mentioning. And so how to balance those kinds of costs, not to say that $75,000 isn't a huge amount of money, but compared to the over $9 billion state budget, it becomes a very small expenditure. Those obviously add up, but whether it is something like that or some of the requests that are made from some of the social service agencies, oftentimes they will frame their requests around the ways in which this is the spending that the state might do is an investment in people so that they are able to be thriving members of a community, or so they are not a burden on other services in a more extreme way than they would be. That was something that I saw as a common thread in a lot of the testimony from many of the recovery programs that came before the Appropriations Committee, in terms of the fact that if someone has access to recovery programming while they're incarcerated, they are less likely to be incarcerated in the future. They're more likely to find a job more quickly after they leave incarceration. I'm interested in how much that framing continues to hold sway, or if the focus becomes more intensely on the need to cut back spending in the short term because there is such concern. I'll bring that over to you, Senator Bongartz.
Well, the starting point is Vermont always has a balanced budget. And so we only have what we have. And this year, and I've heard Senator Perchlik, the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, talk about this in caucus, like basically if you're coming in for money that's not in the budget, you better be ready to tell us where to cut. So it's very very tight, but I still think that people are keeping that lens on investment, because even though we only have what we have, we still have money. There is still spending that's going to take place, and directing it in a way that's going to do the most, short, medium, and long-term good, and hopefully be sustainable or build to sustainability, is going to tend to get priority, I suspect.
I do want to stick with this question of sort of what the horizon might look like in terms of the sort of federal side of the budget and just federal money coming to Vermont in general. Another piece of news from this past week was that the House Committee on Energy and Commerce had sent letters out to 9 different states about potential Medicaid fraud. And Vermont was on that list. It was California, Vermont, Colorado, Massachusetts, Maine, Nebraska, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Washington states were all on that list. Unclear what that may mean, but a lot of these, the letters cited the claims of benefits fraud coming out of Minnesota that is getting a lot of national attention, and looking to expand some of that as a more direct kind of investigation into potential benefits fraud. I'm curious how much that is something that's on the legislature's radar, and what, if anything, the legislature is thinking about in terms of federal sort of not just oversight, but direct interest in Vermont being singled out in this way. I'll bring that over to you, Representative Morrissey.
It's hard because there has been, always discussion about, possible fraud within, different funding that, folks may be receiving. I know a couple of years ago, it was talked about, like when I first went in the legislature, individuals or families receiving help or assistance from the state. I know that they had to put their actual address down as a, their residence. And a few years after that, it came out, or it was put in that, folks could use a P.O. box. And I know there was concern with us being a border state to New York and Massachusetts. Could people be putting a P.O. box that then they could be receiving in the other states? And I remember at the time, I think I was on approach, I asked the question, well, don't we have a, like over the, from each state, kind of compliance folks within agencies that do check with our neighboring states to even, review something like that, or take a general look to see if any activity like that was going on. And it wasn't really apparent that anything like that was going on. But there are other means of fraud that you can see, or even within an agency or that. So again, I would have to see what they're actually talking about, and I'm not totally sure how that would be looked at to correct, and how you would correct it with what funding, or if you would get the state would get some kind of a penalty because of it. Obviously the agency would certainly have to correct it, but I'm not sure how you could, look to either pay back, what was fraudulently used. So that is an interesting question. I'm hoping, that we being targeted as, having fraudulent, I hope that doesn't come to be. But again, it is something that there's more of that activity going on, I think, than in years past, in a general sense. So yeah, we do need to keep an eye on that.
And with the understanding that obviously it's always important to make sure that state programs are being run efficiently and in the way that they're intended, there are the quality assurance departments, as you mentioned, that exist within state services, within the economic services division that provides assistance to families, who will issue letters if there have been overpayments or if someone failed to report a job, does so outside of a time frame, and has to pay back certain benefits that were issued. To my knowledge, Vermont does not have a particularly high fraud rate amongst the 50 states. And so I'm curious if there's any sense within the legislature why Vermont may have made this list of 9. I'll bring that over to you, Senator Bongartz.
It's political. And Jill Olson, who runs the Medicaid program in Vermont, I don't know if there was a story in Digger this morning, and she said, they've actually uncovered a couple instances of fraud. And she said, that doesn't show there's a problem. That shows we're on it. And that's actually what's going on. I believe is that we're on it. And I think that if you look at the state targeted, it's political. And Mary's right. There's always going to be attempts at fraud, but I think Vermont is, and I know I've known Jill Olson for a long, long time. She's really good. That we're, I think that the fact that we've uncovered a couple instances here and there and exposed it and taken it on is actually a suggestion that we're doing it pretty well.
And I want to bring that over to you as well, Representative Corcoran, just for your comment on why Vermont may have made the list, if there's any sense, again, sort of within the legislature or within your conversations with the administrators of the various Agency of Human Services programs, with Medicaid, around any causes for concern or any sense of why this may have come up.
No, well, I mean, Seth, I don't know if I can add much more than Seth did. I think it is what it is, there seems to be a theme on the federal side. If you go against a certain individual, they will come at you every which way. And, that's, unfortunate. I know Attorney General Charity Clark has, I don't know, 11 lawsuits against the federal government. So I'm not sure if that plays into it. But, with any program, like I said, you are going to probably see some type of attempt of fraud. And it's obviously our job to protect that and eliminate that. And I think Vermont does that. But as far as a concern, and I don't really have a concern. I think Vermont does a good job. But while we're on the if you just probably named all those states, it would probably be quite clear. So just leave it at that.
And in the letter that was issued, there are a number of references to instances of fraud that was noted within the state of Vermont. And to Senator Bongartz's point, is that an indication that there's widespread fraud, or an indication that there is actually a fairly robust program within Vermont to find instances of Medicaid benefits getting paid out incorrectly or in ways that need to be investigated? Representative Corcoran, you did mention the ways in which our Attorney General Charity Clark has been filing lawsuits. There was a new one that came out just recently related to tariffs and the Supreme Court decision on tariffs. She joined with other attorneys general on that. We're very close to our time, but I do want to just give you all a chance to talk a little bit about that. So I'll bring it over to you, Senator Bongartz. what does it mean that she's joining in on this, and what could it mean going forward?
Well, the suit basically says that the new round of tariffs are just ignoring the Supreme Court decision, declaring them illegal, and just trying to put a different bow on the package. And she has, Charity has recovered a fair amount of money for Vermont by filing these suits, and prevailed in a number. And so I think, my sense is she's right. I mean, just turned around. The court was pretty clear that tariffs are required, or congressional authorization, and he's just so, yeah. And they're hurting Vermont. I mean, they're clearly hurting. They're hurting Vermont. And there's, you read stories about individual businesses being hurt by the tariffs, but it's hurting the economy, and it's really just a really poor policy. And and plus it's not legal.
And I want to bring that over to you, Representative Morrissey. Have you been hearing anything from constituents about the ways that tariffs have been impacting them, or just generally have you been hearing about impacts in the community?
I've heard from folks that have said that they were not, like, even say getting a car fixed. They couldn't get parts from the manufacturers or different parts for their car to be fixed because of some of the tariff challenges that there are. And I haven't heard from any businesses per se, but I know around the state others have certainly that have especially from those receiving from like especially Canada and that, and that's been a challenging problem within the state because of some of the issues nationally that we don't have the tourism and all of that we once, the strong tourism and folks coming in from Canada like we once have. I know that's been difficult, but then with the tariffs thrown on top of that, it makes the that tourism piece a little bit more difficult for people coming and feeling comfortable coming to the state, or Vermonters going to Canada. It has had some impact.
And Representative Corcoran, I want to give you the chance to chime in on the question of tariffs and particularly sort of the transportation perspective. Is there any particular way that they're intersecting with your work on the Transportation Committee and the costs related to operating, the state's transportation infrastructure, both public and the roadways?
I'm sure there is. Like I said, we haven't really delved into that particular deep dive into the effect, but just the broadness and the materials and everything that you buy, there's no doubt it has an impact. But not only tariffs, but what's going to have a huge impact going into the summer is the cost of oil in this war with Iran. I mean, I locked in for a relatively good rate. I think it was like $2.70. The cost of oil right now, I think, is like around $4.50 on average. So when you figure that what that's going to do for the transportation program is mind-boggling, because that's they need to make that to make the asphalt and everything else. So the gasoline is going through the roof. So those are the major factors, and I'm sure tariffs will too, but it's more of the cost of the gas and oil that is going to have a huge impact, and I don't see any end in sight of those prices going down. So that's unfortunate.
I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you sharing this time, and we will have many more things to discuss on the local, the state, and potentially even the federal and international level in episodes to come. Thank you all very much for another very good conversation.
Jack,
you.
thanks so much.
Thanks, Mac, and thanks to Cat TV for doing this.